All right. So I'll talk about here in a second. So as we kind of get started here, I'll put up an announcement with a little file that has some links on Canvas today that'll kind of help the remainder of you who I have not been able to link up with iClickers. So the issue is there is both registration if you have a physical iClicker on Canvas. So if you do that, it will not, that alone will not link you up. You also have to have that remote registered to your iClicker account. So if you don't have an iClicker account, that's what my announcement and link will kind of be. Basically, if you Google search iClicker student account, click on the first link. Basically, you'll sign up. It's free. You just create a username and password. And then under your profile, there's a place where you can register your remote. So that way, I think the way it works is that it links that up to your iClicker, which then links it up to the Canvas next to two remotes, and then I can sync the grades up from the iClicker cloud.
So if we didn't have already, like the last.
So it will not hurt or impact your grade. You're seeing things up there right now on Canvas. Don't be concerned. I have everything. It's just a matter of getting them registered correctly. So I've got it all logged. As soon as you get your remote registered under your iClicker account, I can resync it and it will automatically start showing up on Canvas. Okay. So, but I need you to register not only on Canvas, but under your iClicker account. If you're having any issues with it, stop by my office hours or after class. I can kind of try to help you out. Like I said, I'll also be putting an announcement up with some links that also kind of have some walkthroughs with there to make sure that everybody's getting it registered correctly in both places. I apologize for the hassle. Before deciding to use it this semester, did not realize they changed it to where you have to have it on both, and that you even had to have an iClicker account. You never used to have that. So I apologize. Like I said, I got it all though. So don't worry about losing points or anything. If you've been here, you've been using it, I've got it stored, and we'll eventually be able to kind of sync it up.
I was gonna ask, how are you using it today?
I'm not going to use it today. In fact, before we get going, I'll even announce, or remember to say again in class, we're actually going to do an online quiz today. So there'll be a quiz that shows up on Canvas after class. Just have a couple questions. It's more so for me to kind of really gauge where you're at, with the material that we've covered. Be kind of similar questions that I would use for iClickers, but I want to ask a couple more that I don't think that we'll have time for in class today, and kind of really gauge where you guys are at. So, any other questions before we get started here today? Okay, so your homework was due last Friday. You will see, I shouldn't say likely, I just have a bad habit in terms like that, but you will see the next homework pop up this afternoon. It'll start with what we start covering today, a little bit from the end of last week, but mainly kind of the first few questions might look like what we did like last Friday, but then kind of quickly look like what we're doing today. And then kind of for the rest of the week, it'll be due 2 weeks from Monday. So I would suggest, because that Monday is actually the Monday before the final, which is on that Friday in class. And so that's kind of 6 or 5 for the final midterm exam. So we're getting closer to that. So it's still 3 weeks away, right? But we're kind of getting closer to that date. I'll also put up a file with an answer key on Canvas. I'll probably put it under its own folder, which is like study materials. And it's basically just some sample problems that you might expect to see that look similar to questions that you'd see on the exam. So those homeworks be up front. Some of the questions might be even a little more difficult than what I expect to do on the exam. You've got a lot of time. Not a lot of people have used it, but you have me as a resource. I want you guys to use that as you're working through those homework problems, because those are kind of your practice for the exam. But I'll give you some that look more like what I would write and what you would kind of see in the exam. And those will pop up on Canvas this afternoon as well. Okay. Any questions before you go on? All right. So a little bit of review, because we did this Friday, but we'll go through it quick, just kind of remind us where we were at. We're talking about equilibrium, and then we were talking about, well, what if the price isn't currently in equilibrium? Right? What might we see? We said, well, an example like this, where would the equilibrium price be? Well, it's where the quantity supplied is exactly equal to the quantity demanded. So if we look here, the price at which quantity supplied is exactly equal to quantity demand is at $3. So what happens if the price is higher than that? So we start to look at all these possible prices that are higher than the equilibrium. What ends up being true? The amount supplied is much greater than the amount that's demanded. Right? So actually let me make sure I'm recording this area. I am. So if you're anyone who missed class and are watching this, you get to see this awkward view of my face. Okay. So at all the prices above the equilibrium, we have more supply than consumers who are demanding the product. We'd say we have a surplus, right? Well, what's the value of that surplus? When we walk through, we kind of choose one of those specific prices. There we go. All right. And it's basically just the difference between the quantity supply and quantity demand. So if we had the price of $5, we go through, supplies, quantity supply is 25, quantity demand is 9, so we've got a surplus of 16 units. We said the exact flip side is, well, what happens if we got a price that's below the equilibrium, right? And kind of visually, right, we're kind of drawing our supply and demand curves. You can kind of see the difference in our supply and demand curve at whatever price we're looking at represents that surplus. We instead then, the stuff we talked about last time is not really relevant right now. So if we then saw prices below the equilibrium, the price is below $3 here, what ends up happening there? Well, now my quantity demanded is much higher than my supply. So I would say there we've got a shortage. People want more than what exists, right? What's the value of that shortage? Well, we would just look at whatever the price was, take that value, quantity demanded, value quantity supplied, and just take the difference between, right? So here, right, we would have a shortage of 21 minus 5 or 16 units.
No, I think it's surplus when it should say short.
You are correct. I should say, yeah. I probably copied pasted that and didn't change it. So thank you for saying that. Those should line up right with what I'm saying. Okay. So that was kind of where we left off. All right. We can kind of think about the visual here. When prices are below the equilibrium, we said that gap in between that supply and demand curve, that would represent our shortage. Okay. So that's kind of where we left off. I'll give you walk us through. Then we just talked about, eventually there'll be pressure for, producers to stop producing or their producers to produce more, people to buy less until that price raises or lowers that equilibrium point. So not using clickers today, but maybe wink, wink, the online quiz will look very similar to this. Okay. So maybe pay attention. So let's say we had something like this. Okay, so we've got our supply and demand curve, and we're told what would be the outcome if the current market price is $35. Okay, now I'm looking at this without giving like the actual amount of the shortage or surplus. What should the equilibrium price and quantity be here? Hard to see. Where does supply and demand affect? The price of 25. Okay, I got the number kind of nice. The quantity, equivalent quantity is 25 as well. So if I've got a price of 35, I know that I'm going to be at a point above the equilibrium. Every price above the equilibrium, what ends up being true? I'm at a lower quantity on my demand curve than I would be at on my supply curve. So if producers are providing more to the market than what consumers are buying, we would say we have a surplus, right? So give you a good way to remember this. Anyone know about surplus stores? It's like the military kind of like they got all this like extra, stuff they're trying to sell. They've got too much of it, right? They got a higher supply than what demand is out there. So the exact amount of the surplus would be 15, and that is the reason why I'm not kind of making you say it's hard to see these values, right? But at that price of 35, my quantity demanded would be what? 20, and my quantity supplied would be 35. So the actual value of that surplus would just be the difference between those. Okay? So take a difference between what? 35 and 20, we should get that surplus of 15. Okay? Any questions on that? Right. So then what would people do? Well, the prices, there's more out there than what people are demanding. So producers stop producing as much. Well, I'm going to produce if I can't sell it, right? I'm just paying to make this, but I'm getting nothing in return. I can't sell it. So we see suppliers kind of providing less of this as they kind of lower the price, right? And provide less to the market. What happens to demand? Well, as the price starts going down, people start buying slowly more and more, up into the point where we hit that equilibrium price and quantity of 25. What if we had, I don't know, a price of $15? Well, that's too crazy. If we've got a price that's below my equilibrium, what's true about every price below that equilibrium price of 25? Well, the point that I'm at on my supply curve are all much lower quantities than the points where I'm at on my demand curve. So I've got people that want way more than what is being supplied, right? So we would call that a shortage. Right? Demand is way too high relative to how much is being provided to the market. Now, what's the actual value of that shortage? We go to $15. Quantity supplied is 15. Quantity demanded is 30. So there we would have kind of our shortage of 15 units. And then from there, producers start slowly increasing the price, providing more and more to the market. But as that price is going up, people are wanting to buy less and less, up into the point where we get every unit produced is being purchased, right? Quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded, or that equilibrium point. Okay. Any questions over any of this? Okay. So like I said, a little bit of reviewers kind of reminding where we were left, but also might help you on that online quiz. Okay. So what we might also see, we can kind of think about this operating through prices, but governments can kind of step in, and usually we think about it as, I think a lot of people, I don't know, you've heard the term like quotas, like where the government requires a certain amount to be produced, and that can occur. More likely, the government can use things like price caps and say, we're not going to allow the price of this good to go above this level, right? Or we can say, I'm not going to allow the price of this good to go below a certain level, right? So hopefully I have a couple examples of this, and we kind of think about how setting those prices will result in surpluses and shortages. So we look at an example in the 70s, there was a gasoline, price of gas is going way up. So the government said, well, gee, people have to drive, we got to keep the economy going. We're going to cap oil prices. Right? So what happens if I cap oil prices? So let's think about a marker that works. Let's say, there we go. Let's say we've currently got this market. And here's the equilibrium price and quantity. Right? And we're starting out, right? P1 and Q1. Government says that equilibrium price is way too high. A lot of people can't afford that. Our economy is slowing down because people can't even get to work. And being a little bit exaggeratory here, but that's the general idea. So they come in and say, okay, well, look, we're going to set a price cap and say nobody can charge above this amount for gasoline or oil, or however we want to operate this. So if the government comes in and sets this, so we'll call this kind of our price cap, what's going to happen to the quantity supplied and quantity demanded? Well, at a lower price, way more people want to purchase this good, right? That was the goal, right? We want people to be able to and have not only willingness, but the ability, right? They only got a certain amount of money, so they have to have the willingness and ability to purchase this good. So by lowering the price, more people are able to and willing to purchase gas or oil. What's the problem? In response to that, what do the producers do?
They lower prices, so that means they supply less of it.
They have to. They're forced by the government to lower prices. And so at those lower prices, it's not as, it's no longer profitable to supply all of these units to the market because the marginal cost, remember that's what the supply curve reflects, the marginal cost of all these units now is above the price they can sell it. So they basically will be taking a hit, right? Have negative profit for every single unit past this point. So by setting this price cap, what did the government actually do? Well, they didn't set a quota, but in response to these prices, quantity supplied in the market is going to be lower than what the equilibrium would be. So it doesn't matter that people want to buy more of it. There's not going to be more of it to buy, right? We're going to end up with kind of shortages, right? People are going to want to buy more than kind of what's provided to the market. So we kind of see the government stepping in, kind of led to these huge shortages in I guess, society. Okay. Give you another example. Let me see if I can find a black marker that works, because I think this red's a little bit easier to, or harder to see. I'll give you an example of maybe not a price cap, but the government forcing the price of something to be higher. And this is a little bit of a look into something that we'll talk more in depth about towards the end of the semester, but at least if we speak some avenues of it early on. So not going to expect you to know this for the kind of upcoming homework, but I think it'll help the idea of setting prices make a little more sense. So instead of pricing quantity, let's think about this as the quantity of labor, right? The number of people that are willing to work. The price of labor we'll call, we'll call wages. You could call salary, whatever, you know, it's this interchangeable term, I guess. Right? To hire more people, you would have to pay them whatever the going rate is. Right? To make this a little bit easier, let's think about like the context of fast food, right? Because there's a certain policy that reflects what the government does in practice, right? So if this market was in equilibrium, I'm going to call this the equilibrium quantity of labor, and we would see, let's use ones and stars, the equilibrium wage rate. That's where we're starting out. Well, then the government comes in and says, man, this wage is really low. Like, it's really hard for people to survive at this lower wage, right? So what does the government do? Hopefully some of you heard, I definitely heard that at one point in my life. Minimum wages, right? There's a time where I definitely worked for minimum wage. So, my lifestyle reflected. So, the government comes in and says, man, you can't pay people this wage. They can't even afford to live, right? So they set this minimum wage, and we're all thinking this is a great thing, right? We're going to pay people more money. There's kind of a cost, there's an issue, right? Just like when we set price caps, right? This caused shortages. Now, if we've got minimum wages, you can kind of think about this as what we'll end up calling price ceilings. Or sorry, not price ceilings. I already did that one. Price floors, right? You can't have a price that's below this. So, you know, here, our minimum wage becomes our new equilibrium wage. I, as a company, unless I'm doing something illegal, paying from cash, I can't pay you below this amount, right? Well, what happens in response? Well, workers, right? This is kind of weird now. They're actually the suppliers of labor. Before, it was the companies who were providing whatever product they were making. Well, now here, we're looking at the labor market. The supply of labor actually comes from you and me, the workers. So quantity supplied is much higher at these higher minimum wages, right? If you tell me that I can go work at a fast food place for $5 an hour, I'm say, forget it, right? If you tell me I can make $25 an hour, not too bad, right? There's a lot more people who are willing to supply their labor. You can see at these higher wages, quantity supply goes up. But what happens to the quantity demanded? Which, think about now, these are the companies. They demand labor, right? They want to pay workers to work with. So now the quantity demanded at this much higher wage, this higher price, is going to be much lower. So what do I have now? Quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, so I've got a surplus. But here, if I'm thinking about this in terms of the labor market, I've got more people willing to work than companies willing to provide jobs. So what's that going to cause in the economy? So if I've got a surplus of workers, it's kind of like basically saying the opposite way. Yeah, a shortage of jobs or unemployment. Right? Now, for everybody, right, the new equilibrium quantity ends up coming down here because these are the only jobs that companies are trying to fill. So we end up with, yeah, if you keep your job and you're being paid minimum wage, it's great. The wage goes up, right? But if for everybody who kept their job, all of these people lose their job. Their new wage rate is 0. Right? They lost their job. So, is it a good thing? That's a bit of a, we can measure that later on. We're not quite there yet, being able to see if it's a good thing for society. But yeah, if you kept your job, the minimum wage is great, but there's going to be a lot fewer jobs out there. So it's bad for some people who aren't able to be able to land them. So I'm simplifying a little bit. Like I said, we'll kind of break it down more in depth later in the semester, but it kind of relates to this idea now that if the government wants to either, limit these quantities, they can set price caps or these kind of price floors, right? Price floor, probably really only see that mainly in the labor market, which is why I kind of use that example. Okay. So now we're going to break this down. You might have you guys look at this for a while and see if some of you, well, sorry, I'll go through this and then I'll ask some questions along the way. So I've got a supply and demand equation up here. Up to this point, I've just given you visuals. So I've drawn the supply and demand curve for you, but let's think about if I had to graph these, could I do it? Okay. So I'm giving you the equation for supply and the equation for demand. We'll talk about this a little bit, right? They've got intercepts, demand equation, that B, right, minus B times 20, that should be negative because it's downward sloping. Then supply is upward sloping, so we got that positive 15 times the quantity. So how can we graph these? And how can we solve for the equilibrium price and quantity using these equations? Well, first of all, if I'm graphing this demand curve, where is it going to start at? Why? Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, the kind of constant in my demand equation is 100, right? But another way to think about it is basically the point where your demand curve starts is the price when nothing would be bought or quantity equals 0. Because if I plug a 0 into quantity there, 5 times 0 is 0, 100 minus 0 is 100. That's where my demand curve starts, right? So if the price was 100, nobody's going to buy anything. My quantity is 0. And then, kind of downward sloping from here. Now remember, our demand curve tells us the marginal benefit. So I think a couple questions I have here. The first one is, what's the marginal benefit of that 5th unit? So I said when we have our demand equation, we can think of what the price is reflecting to us is, well, people will pay up to the price of whatever their marginal benefit is. So another way we can think about the demand equation is it's telling us the marginal benefit of these different units. So if I want the marginal benefit of what unit here? The 5th unit? How could I find that? I'm just plugging 5 into my demand equation. Or think about it differently visually. I'm saying, okay, and I might have to erase this, but for now, if quantity was 5, at what price would someone be willing to purchase that 5th unit? Or what would their marginal benefit have to be? Yeah, right. So I plug this in, right? So I'll plug in my quantity of 5 here. 100 minus 5 times 5 is 75. So I can find the marginal benefit of different quantities. Here I just chose the 5th one.
So really, you don't even have to graph it unless.
No, I'm just doing this for, you can actually do this all with just the equations. I'm just kind of showing you how the visualization of it as we work through it. If I wanted to graph my supply curve, where would it start? Yeah, it's going to be the price at which quantity supplied is 0. So quantity of 0, 0 times 15 is 0. 20 plus 0 is 20. That's where it starts, right? So if the price is 20, nobody's going to supply anything to the market.
Say we're graphing this, right? We started to, where is the next one?
So how would I find the next one, right? So let's think about so in this class, keeping this simple, right? Quantities we're thinking about 0, 1, 2, 3. But in reality, these quantities actually represent probably like 5 would represent like 5,000, right? So there is much more of a continuous kind of line. But we'll keep it simple, just 1 unit increase. Right? So the next point I would want to graph is when the quantity was 1. How could I find the price at which that first unit will be purchased? Plug a 1 into my supply equation. Because my supply equation tells me, well, this is the, companies will only provide it if the price is greater or equal to their marginal cost. So I plug in a quantity of 1 times 15 is 15, plus 20, 35. So I know the price has to be at least 35 to get that first unit. And then I would have to kind of do every single point. Now, for the equations, like I don't have to, I mean, I don't always have to draw these out if I don't want to, but if you want to do it point by point, that is how you would do it. I think generally on the homework's like, as long as you get the intercept right, then you're kind of drawing this upper slope factors, which represents marginal cost. So what's the marginal cost of the third unit? Just like with demand, when I'm looking at my 20 plus 15, when I'm looking at my supply curve, I can also think about this price is telling me, well, this is, you know, people only provide this to the market if that price is greater than or equal to their marginal cost. So I can think about the price as really just reflecting the marginal cost to me from the supply curve. So if I want the marginal cost of the third unit, what could I do? Yeah, right. Plug in my quantity of 3. 3 times 15 is 45 plus 20. What? 65. So I'm thinking about third unit here. That marginal cost would be 65. Okay. Any questions up to this point? I'm going to take it a little bit further here. So let's get a little bit here. So what if we want to solve for the equilibrium price and quantity? So notice I kind of asked you about marginal benefits and marginal costs there, but I can work in either direction where I could tell you like, well, if the price was 65, what would the quantity supplied be? Well, I'd plug in the price of 65, and I have to do a little bit of algebra to solve for what that quantity would be. So in that, working backwards there is going to be how we actually solve for this equilibrium price and quantity. So I'll have the visual, but then I'll also show you how you do it with the equation. So kind of already had that over there. I guess if you are taking notes, it's okay to use the same graph. I'm just going to try to make it a little bit cleaner here. Let's start at 120. And we want to find what is this equilibrium price and quantity. So I know that that equilibrium point will be the price at which quantity supplied is equal to quantity demand. Or another way of saying that is if it's where the supply and demand curve intersect, it's the point where my marginal cost of the last unit provided to the market is exactly the same as the marginal benefit to the last consumer that purchased it, right? Because that's what my supply and demand curves reflect. And that's the point I'm looking for. Where do they hit each other? Where are they equal? So if I've got equations, right, when I had the price is equal to something for supply and price is equal to this for demand, kind of reflecting that relationship between price and quantity supplied and price and quantity demanded, so I can think of those prices as being marginal cost and marginal benefit. So if I set the marginal cost to be equal to the marginal benefit, what I'm really saying is take that supply curve, which I know reflects marginal costs, set it equal to my demand curve, which I know reflects the marginal benefits. So I have equations for these, right? So marginal cost for the supply or the price is equal to 20 plus 15 cubed. Demand, my demand equation for that price reflected marginal benefit is what? 100 minus 5 cubed. I've got one equation. I've got one thing, the quantity that I'm trying to find. Just a little bit of algebra here. Okay. So I'm going to subtract 20 from both sides. I'll try to break this down step by step. Okay. And the next step is add this 5q to both sides. It's a 0 q. What's the last step? Divide both sides by 20. I have to move my work over here, but I should get that equilibrium quantity is 4. So I basically just found my equilibrium quantity there. Okay. All I did was set that supply and demand equation equal to each other, and then it's just a little bit of algebra. Yeah, how do I find the price? There's actually 2 ways I can find the price. So I'm looking for this price I plug the quantity of 4 into my supply curve, right? So that was what? Plug that quantity of 4 into my supply curve. I end up with a price of 60, 80. That's another way I could have found it. I could have also plugged that quantity into my demand curve. And hopefully, I've done everything right. It should be hitting at the exact same price. Sure enough, 4 times 5 is 20. 100 minus that, I get the exact same equilibrium price. Questions or any of the steps there? If I have to do my algebra too quickly, feel free to ask me what I did, or if you can't read what I'm doing here. So, up to this point, kind of show you the visuals, but we can also solve for these points and come up with actual values, right? I don't have kind of the the nice kind of grid lines here. I can actually solve for those quantities, not even with any visuals. I can actually just use equations. Now, if I'm suggesting something as you're working through these, I would draw the visual along with what I'm doing just because it helps make a little more sense, right? It also reminds me, oh yeah, demand is marginal benefit. So the demand curves tell me the marginal benefit of the different units. Supply is marginal, it's telling me the marginal cost of the different units. Set the demand, supply curves equal to each other. I don't know. I just think it helps to kind of have that visual aid as you work through it. Any other questions before we keep moving here?
Easiest part.
Huh?
It's probably the only way to start. Makes sense.
Yeah, so it is definitely, I think if you're a mathematical minded person, this makes a lot more sense, right? And you also gotta have that visualization to go along with it. We'll start to use these equations more as we talk about things. So I kind of jumped the gun a little bit. So I want to show you guys a tax example. Down the road, we'll actually think about how shifts in my supply and demand curve would actually play out with the equations. And I won't push you too far in terms of what I ask you on the exam when it comes to that, but I would expect you to know how to be able to solve for equilibrium price and quantity given to a supply and demand equation.
On the exam, would you give us formulas?
Yeah, I'm never gonna give you the line and expect you to back out what the slope and intercept are. I'll give you the actual supply and demand equations. Yep. Just like this, basically this example.
This also going to be on our quiz.
Probably be pretty nice. If you're paying attention, you show up today. These questions should really help you with the online quiz. Okay? All right. Like I said, those online quiz are meant to be more of effort points, right? Showing up, you're paying attention. You should have that in your notes somewhere. You should be able to go back. Okay? All right. So I think we did everything I want to do here. We talked about marginal cost. We had in time.
You go back next time.
Yeah, I think I want to try to do one more thing. So push you a little bit further here, but I'm going to basically draw this again. And we're going to think about how could I identify shortages or surpluses? I'm only going to do one of them, but at least have an example of one of working with these equations. So I'll have my visual aid, my supply and demand curve up here so that we can just kind of think about what we're doing with the equations visually. So let's say instead of that equilibrium price and quantity, like I've solved for those, what was that, 80 over there? Just as a kind of reference. Let's say instead I tell you the price is, actually, I think that's going to not be a nice number. Let's do. Let's say instead the government comes in, sets a price cap of $50. Okay. So the government comes in visually, sets this price cap at $50, somewhere below the equilibrium. Now, right away, we know what's going to occur here, surplus or a shortage. Well, my quantity demanded, the point at my demand curve, much higher than quantity supplied, so that's shortage. People want to buy more than there is. How can I figure out the value of the shortage?
Would you plug 50 either into either demand or supply at peak?
So if I plug it into either one, it's going to tell me different things. So we'll do one first. So let's say I plug it into my supply curve. What should I be able to figure out? That price of 50, I can actually figure out the supply curve tells me the relationship between price and quantity supplied. So I can figure out at this lower price, how much will producers provide to the market? How can I do that? Well, it's a little bit trickier than what we were doing before because here's my supply equation. I've now got my price of 50 that I can plug in. And I say it's a little bit trickier, but it's really just a little more algebra, right? Because I've got one equation, I've got one unknown, so I can just move things around so I can figure out what Q is. So I'll subtract 20 from both sides here. I'll then do what? Divide both sides by 15. And remember, probably to be a little bit more correct, this was my supply curve. So if I'm not in equilibrium, quantity supplied won't be equal to quantity demanded. So I need to remember that that's actually representing the quantity supplied there from my supply equation. Okay. Now, the reason why I didn't write QS and QB when I was kind of solving for the equilibrium is because I know that in equilibrium, those should be the exact same thing. So I just can call it Q. But when I'm dealing with a situation where I'm not in equilibrium, the quantity supplied might be very different than the quantity demanded, which is why we have surpluses and shortages. But that price of 50, my quantity supplied is 2 units, right? Well, what would at that price of 50, you go over to the demand curve, and that would tell me what the quantity demanded is. Do this in black here. So let's say I've got what my demand equation was 100 minus 5. So this was our demand curve. I've got that price cap of 50, so I plug that price of 50 in, right? That's what the government has kind of set the price to be. And now it's the same process, just a little bit of algebra. Now I have to remember the quantity for my demand curve, it's actually representing the quantity demanded. So I could write Q subscript E then. And then, I don't know, move things over. This is where several ways to do it. For me, it's easier to think about this way. So if I add that 5 quantity, I end up with that over here. And then subtract 50 from both sides. Divide both sides by 5. All right. And I end up with a quantity demanded of 10 there. Also, if I ever do mental math or like look at a number wrong, let me know. I'm pretty sure I did this one right, but there are times where I will definitely make a mistake. So here, what was the value? I got my quantity demanded is 10, my quantity supplied is 2. So I would have a shortage of 8 units, right? I would just take the difference between the two. So my shortage value just be quantity demanded minus quantity supplied. All right, 10 minus 2. Yeah, so that was kind of setting this up as not necessarily like if I told you the government comes in and set the price 50, you would have to tell me whether or not there's a surplus or a shortage, right? Well, I know it's surplus because I can kind of see, well, much higher demand than supply at that lower price. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, we were starting out saying what's going to be the result of the government setting that price cap of $50. Okay. I think very quickly I said it was going to be a shortage, but we didn't know that per se. We had to kind of see, oh, well, yeah, we're setting a price below the equilibrium. We know that the quantity demand will be higher than the quantity supplied. We know we will have a shortage, but then using the equations, we can actually solve what the actual amount of the shortage would be. Other questions on that? Okay with this right now? That's okay, we can be seeing it kind of the first time. Yeah, so these are the types of questions, kind of combining a lot of things we've talked about, but sprinkling in now being able to solve them using the equations. So we're going to transition a little bit different of a topic. It's going to be related to demand, and we'll eventually get back to supply. But it allows us to think about the demand curve a little bit different. Okay? So we're going to start talking about these things called elasticities. You kind of think about the elasticity. If you want to, this might be good starting out. Elasticity, you can think of actually meaning like responsiveness. Okay. So if you think about something being elastic, what does that mean? It's really stretchy. Yeah, it's really responsive to the force I'm putting on it. So like a rubber band, it's very elastic. It's very responsive to me pulling on it. What is not elastic or what's inelastic, if I try to pull this apart, right? There's no elasticity. I can't pull that apart, right? So kind of solids, right, are not elastic. So we're instead going to be talking about the elasticity not of different goods. Well, we are talking about the elasticity of goods, but not in response to me pulling on them, in response to price change. So how responsive are consumers to price changes of different goods? Kind of give you just a quick setup. You can think about different, how that might vary, okay? So let's say I increase, give you the most extreme examples. So let's say I increase the price of a pack of gum by like $100. How much, well, what do you think happens to the quantity demanded or the amount of gum purchased? Dramatically goes down. I would think zero, unless someone has like a gum addiction. I know something like nicotine gum or something, right? But all right, you can imagine that is very responsive price. In fact, it might even have to be a large price change. If you just double the pack of gum, I mean, go from $1 to $2, I might stop buying your brand of gum and just buy the other ones. Right? So there, I could see small price changes, and people would still stop buying that particular brand of gum, right? If I went from $1 to $2 or whatever. What's something that might be very, so that we would say it's very responsive, that would be a very elastic good. What would be a very inelastic good? Let's say I increase the price of something by, I think generally the way we think about, let's say I increase the price of something by $1,000, right? Generally, we think about that's probably going to increase the amount bought by quite a bit, but not necessarily, right? So it's going to depend on the characteristics of the goods, which we'll talk to here in a second. So what happens to the amount of insulin that a diabetic person buys if you increase the price by $1,000? I mean, I guess some people out there might not have the money to buy it, but if assuming you had enough, your budget allowed you to then still purchase it, you got to buy the same amount of insulin. I don't know how, I've got family with a diabetic, like you can't just change the amount of insulin you take. Like you need a certain amount. So that's why when it comes to like drugs and things like that, we tend to see some like price controls, right? Because we know that it's very inelastic. You can change the price a ton, people keep buying the same amount because I have to have this drug to survive. So we're going to have these different elasticities or different responsiveness to price changes. But the way we're going to measure it is not just in dollar amounts. So I was kind of giving you technically not correct ways to think about it, but we're just starting out. So sometimes it's just good to have a general idea and then we can be more specific or technical. So what we're going to do is measure the percent change in the quantity demanded. So how much does that change what people are buying to the response of a percentage change in price? Okay. So we're not going to think about the dollar amount change. We're actually going to have to calculate the percentage changes. Okay. So you kind of imagine even if I increase the price of a pack of gum by $1, it goes from $1 to $2. That was like 100% price increase. I doubled the price. But I can think about that same $1 increase if I put it on a, I don't know, new car, that is like the smallest percent change in price, right? People probably won't even notice it. So we're going to be measuring things in terms of the percentages, not just the dollar amounts. So I think the way to think about, price, elasticity of demand. That's the percentage change. Percentage change in price. So we talk about a couple different types of elasticity. We'll focus really on demand elasticity first, but really it's the price elasticity. So it's the responsiveness to price or to whatever is changing. Here, we're looking at price changes. So whatever is changing or the price is what is changing, that's going to be what's in your denominator. And then it's the price elasticity of demand, right? So you're saying, okay, here's what's changing. That goes in the denominator. So what's changing goes in the denominator. And then what is responding to that price change? Well, it's how much demand there is, how much consumers are buying. That goes in the numerator. And we'll do things like price elasticity of supply. Imagine there. What's changing? Well, we're still seeing a change in price, but price elasticity of supply, we'd be interested in how much does wine supply change. So it might be a good way to kind of works, right? The price elasticity of demand. So this, the first thing that we're saying is that's what's changing. The price is changing. That's what goes in the denominator. The second thing, price elasticity of here of demand, that's what's responding to that. So, just kind of give it an easy kind of example of how we're going to come up with these different measures of elasticity. Let's say a local gym increases its membership prices by 50%. As a result, 25% fewer people purchase the membership. Well, there, what was changing? The price of the membership. So the percent change in price was 50%, or 50 in the denominator. How did demand respond? Well, supply and demand fell by 25%. We have a negative 25 up there in our numerator. We would say the price elasticity of demand is negative 25. Question that shouldn't be too up yet. We're just kind of trying to set us up pretty much for the next class. So we can kind of jump. What's going to be true? There's a little bit of a caveat to this because generally when we talk about elasticity, we'll do one more step here. But if I calculate the price elasticity of demand, what's going to be a feature of it that's always going to be true? It should always be. So anytime I see a positive price change, what should happen in supply and demand? When prices go up, demand should go down. So if I see a positive change in price, I should see the percentage change in supply and demand is negative. So I should always have a negative price elasticity of demand. In fact, what if instead of a price going up, let's say the percentage change in price, let's say the gym lowered it by 50%. What should happen to quantity demand there? So what would we have? Negative value, positive or negative, right? So our price elasticity of demand should always have a negative value. And think here, so it's always going to be negative. Okay? And that really just reflects that there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity. Now, when we talk about it and compare, generally we just drop the negative sign, right? Because we know they're all going to be negative, and we're just concerned with the magnitude of elasticity.
Even with a negative change in price, it's still negative?
Yeah, if I lower the, or sorry, I read it. No, right? So if I see a lower price, what can happen with quantity demanding? It should go up. So the elasticity, my numerator and my denominator will always have different signs. So my elasticity will always be negative.
That makes sense.
Okay, so get on that online quiz done before we start class on Wednesday. It's pretty easy. We can't get today. We're going to pick up on elasticities. Put that next one we're signing up there as well as the link to kind of help any of you still having. All right, I'll see you guys on Wednesday.
410.